In the book and the podcast, Lewis explores the use of objectivity as a tool to uphold the status quo and suppress diverse voices in journalism by essentially disqualifying from meeting the standard of objectivity anyone who is outside of a white, male, non-trans subjectivity, including women, people of color, especially Black people, immigrants, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and Muslims. In the book, Lewis notes that though the people defining objectivity or neutrality are the people in power, that doesn't actually make them objective or neutral. Trans journalists and trans stories provide a great lens for the limits of objectivity. In the blog post I mentioned earlier, Lewis writes, quote, "As a member of a marginalized community, I am transgender, I've never had the opportunity to pretend that I can be neutral. After years of silence, denial about our existence, the media has finally picked up on trans stories, but the nature of the debate is over whether or not we should be allowed to live and participate in society, use public facilities, and expect not to be harassed, fired, or even killed. Obviously, I can't be neutral or centrist in a debate over my own humanity," end quote. And in fact, no one can or should be neutral on their own or anyone else's humanity. But somehow, in the reporting of trans stories, it is only the trans journalist's subjectivity that is called into question, as if a non-trans writer has no particular relationship to gender. One observation I can share from 17 years working at a feminist research center, 5 years as a parent, and a lifetime of living as someone with a weird gender is that people's personal investments and attachments to the binary gender system run deep. And for people with normative genders and sexualities, these beliefs can often go unquestioned. And so a non-trans journalist reporting on a trans story is generally not required to examine their own subjectivity and gender ideology. As Lewis writes, quote, "Trans people are debated and discussed without being granted the authority to weigh in," end quote. These stories have real and often harmful consequences for trans people by granting legitimacy to transphobic ideologies that lead to violence against trans and gender nonconforming people, most acutely felt by trans and gender nonconforming kids, as well as trans women of color whose deaths are generally or underreported and whose lives deserve so much more. In The View from Somewhere, Lewis describes objectivity as a useless frame for talking about trans people precisely because gender is a subjective experience. While so much mainstream reporting on trans stories relies on harmful obsessions with notions of authenticity or proving gender, a trans framing upholds the role of choice and desire in self-determination. One of the writers Lewis engages with in The View from Somewhere is Meredith Talusan. Meredith is an award-winning journalist and author. They have written features, essays, and opinion pieces for many publications, including The New York Times, The Guardian, The Atlantic, Vice, Matter, Back Channel, The Nation, and The American Prospect. She has contributed to several books, including the New York Times bestselling Not That Bad, Dispatches from Rape Culture, edited by Roxane Gay. Her memoir, Fairest, is forthcoming from Viking Penguin Random House. There's so much to talk about, and I can't wait to hear this conversation between Lewis and Meredith, so I'm going to turn it over to them.
Thank you so much, Hope. I was thinking, as you were talking, about how, one of the things that's revealed in a firing situation is, who your allies are and kind of comrades in the struggle. And I feel just really honored and happy to be here with Barnard, BCRW, Hope, who have been just such important allies and supports to me, and also Meredith, who's been such an important ally and support to me. So thank you both so much for that. And thank you all for being here. I want to start by asking you a question. And because I think that you are a great crowd and I just have a good vibe on this, it's not going to be like a super easy question. And this is a find a friend, turn to a partner, maybe try to meet somebody new to talk about your answer to this question. Say your name, your pronouns, if you don't already know each other. And then the question that I want to ask you is to think about a time when you changed your mind about something and what helped you get there, what it took to change your mind. So I'm going to throw that to all of you and give you a couple minutes to talk about that. Thank you all for indulging that. That right now, that is one of my questions that I'm just thinking about a lot. So I'm just going to let you simmer on that as we get into our discussion. So I want to start by talking a little bit about myself and kind of how I came to this critique of objectivity and this like moment where everything came to a head when I got fired and led to this book. So I came out as trans in my teens, around like late 90s, early 2000s, and in a time when there was very little media coverage really at all of trans people and trans communities, but what there was tended to misrepresent or just not represent like genderqueer, non-binary people. And so my sort of whole consciousness around storytelling and narrative was formed in a social justice activist kind of context, right, where we knew that as trans people, to advocate for ourselves, we had to tell our own stories and that we had to shift the narrative in some way. But mostly, I mean, we were really focused on the power of telling our own stories and not even necessarily engaging with this supposedly objective mainstream media context. And then through a number of twists and turns later, I ended up becoming a news reporter. And on my first or second day in that job, like somebody sat me down and was like, you're gonna have to stop doing your activism and also not cover the issues that you've been connected to publicly in the past. And at the time I was new and I was nervous and I really wanted this like cool radio job that I was so excited to have and wanted to do this work, and so just kind of signed on for this professional standard, right? And continued to do some activism kind of behind the scenes. In Chicago, where I used to be really involved with prison abolition work there, but not publicly, and went on to, I lived in Ohio for a while working at a radio station, and then moved to New York to work for Marketplace. That whole time kind of performing this role of the objective journalist, even though I didn't believe in it. And there were a lot of, I think, moral and ethical and political compromises in that. And in 2016, as I was covering the primaries in Ohio, Donald Trump's primary campaign, the kind of white supremacist movement building that was coursing through that campaign, and feeling unable in the context I was working in to name that, right? Because even just naming it was considered something partisan. And so that revealed again and again how objectivity is, as my colleague who works with me on the podcast says, it's the ideology of the status quo. And that's Ramona Martinez is her name, and she kind of coined that based on her own experience in this context. And all of that led to this moment where, then I spoke out about it and was fired and went to the national media and sort of made a big fuss around the issue for a couple of different reasons. And I think one was seeing the ways in which objectivity is used to gatekeep and silence marginalized and oppressed people. And the other one was in the context of working in public radio, seeing all of this doublespeak around diversity and a lot of tokenism and the idea that these media organizations want more diversity, right? But as soon as people sort of speak up for their community or for themselves or try to change the actual systems and structures and ideology of that space, they are punished or fired or persecuted or made to be so scared that they don't do it in the first place. And so I was having that experience as a white trans person. It probably took longer because I'm white than it would have had I been a person of color working in that context to be like faced with that to the extent that I was. And so that's kind of how I came to all of this and to this research. Meredith, Meredith has been somebody who's taught me a lot about objectivity and my thinking about it. And so I'm curious how you similarly sort of first came into your thinking around this issue.
Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, I think for people who aren't familiar with my background, I am a first-generation Filipino immigrant. I'm albino, and I grew up in a rural part of the Philippines. In the 1980s, during the Marcos administration. For people who don't know Ferdinand Marcos, he was he declared martial law 4 years into his reign, and then proceeded to not hold any elections for the next 16 years, right? So I was living as a child under a martial law dictatorship, but was not aware that that was happening until Marcos's main opposition came back, who was living in exile in the United States, came back to the Philippines and was then assassinated at the airport. And that happened when I was 9 years old. And I remember really clearly having this just dawning realization that the world that I had imagined was real was actually completely fabricated, right? That this person who I was taught to revere as a figure who was the personification of good was in fact the type of person who was assassinating all of his political opponents, jailing journalists, including friends of my family who couldn't tell me because they were afraid that I would be vulnerable if I was aware of this information. And I think that that sort of formative experience really, kind of like set me on a trajectory of being really skeptical of whatever it is authority figures or institutions are trying to communicate is the story or is the truth. And so when I came to the States, I ended up, editing my high school newspaper in a conservative California public school where they actually physically tore out all of the non-abstinence related material in the state-mandated textbook. And I was the type of editor who, whose the newspaper was always, was constantly in danger of getting shut down by the principal, like that sort of like high school cliche. I lived that cliche in high school. And then I guess, so I then ended up being a scholarship kid at Harvard, where I ended up majoring in English and doing literature. Even though I was interested in journalism at Harvard, the main outlet for that is the Harvard Crimson, and you essentially have to live a lifestyle if you work for the Harvard Crimson, and I did not want to live that lifestyle. I also was too poor to live that lifestyle because you have to work numerous, volunteer hours to do that, and I had to have a work-study job. So I thought that I was like out of journalism. I did a creative writing MFA, and then started a PhD in comparative literature at Cornell. And then sometime around like 2012, 2013, there were more and more translated, and yes, I transitioned somewhere in that time. But was relatively private, was not, sort of super public. I was out to friends, but was not particularly public about having transitioned. And so around 2013, one of my friends at Cornell ended up leaving his PhD program and becoming an editor at the American Prospect. And he asked me, for a couple of years to write on trans issues. And I just didn't feel ready at the time. And then one day I did in like April 2014. And I wrote an opinion piece, which then got shared on Twitter. So then editors started contacting me. And then over time, I became a lot more interested in other people's stories. So then I started reporting long-form pieces about trans people's lives. But throughout that entire time, like this question of when you came to believe that objectivity didn't exist, I just, because like of my formative experiences, I just have never really, like I guess like when I was 5, maybe I believed that objectivity existed, but it was just never a question for me that I was writing from a place of radical subjectivity, and that also that if I were to assume the voice of objectivity, what I was actually assuming was a white, cisgender, et cetera, right? Like normative voice, and it was not a voice that I wanted to adopt. So yeah, so that's sort of my journey. And I think, so Lewis and I have had these trajectories in terms of, coming to our reporting. But I think you had a more, just sort of like, how should we say that? Dramatic, stark awakening from getting fired from Marketplace, and have that, sort of like be super public, for writing what, I remember reading that Medium post and thinking that it was just obvious, right? It was like just, oh, like this is reality, right? But somehow like it got you in deep trouble. And I think one of the things that I'm really most curious about is then you got in deep trouble, you communicated what you felt was true at the time, but then you wrote a whole book about it. And you delved super, super deeply into these issues. And I was just wondering, I don't know, like what has come out of that investigation? How are you a different person now that you've conducted that investigation and written the book, compared to the person that you were during that period of time when you were getting fired and there was just like all of this attention that happened as a result of that?
Yeah, so I think it's true that there was some like naivete on my part. Like I knew that objectivity wasn't real, right? What I didn't fully grasp at that time was like how extreme and sort of authoritarian the reaction to a critique of objectivity would be in that political moment. And I think my privilege in certain ways had probably sheltered me from that, right? And then in that moment, I was like, well, I'm sure this has happened before. Like, this must have happened a bunch of times. I'm not the first person to have this critique of objectivity, right? I know that. So what happened to all the other people who did? And where did they go? And so that was some of the driving force behind researching the book, was like looking for, I knew there had to be stories out there about journalists who had worked outside of this objective framework. And I'd heard about that in sort of a narrow sense, like advocacy journalism or like left-wing journalism or right-wing journalism. But I was curious about folks who weren't, where it wasn't necessarily like a partisan thing or a self-identified like advocacy journalism, but like just folks who had been in some way doing journalism or adjacent to the mainstream journalism industry or whatever, who had been pushing back on this in similar ways and been, and just what had happened to them, right? And so that's a lot of what the book is about, is the history, so kind of tracing objectivity from its very early origins in the 1830s and 1840s, and how that was actually about the changing business model of journalism and this like performance of neutrality in order to sell more papers, and also to underwrite papers through advertising. Like the advertising funding model for journalism went hand in hand with this idea of like a neutral newspaper that quote unquote everybody reads, which of course we know was never everybody. It was like a certain normative audience that's being assumed and targeted and advertised to. And that was also true in public radio when I worked in public radio. So all the way back to that history, and then looking at, kind of the development of these ideas around balance and neutrality, during the Jim Crow era and during the time period of lynchings, and how Ida B. Wells was this activist journalist who constantly stood outside of any sort of neutral, professionalized conception of journalism and did some of the most important investigation into lynching that we still depend on today to understand that history. So she's been a really inspiring figure. And then sort of up through the 100 years that followed, like just learning about more and more figures, right, in queer and trans media, as well as labor organizers. I think one of the most fascinating, like, little insights to me was I was looking for objectivity became sort of codified in the 20s and 30s in journalism ethics codes and those sorts of rules, and in journalism schools. And so I thought, okay, at some point after that, somebody must have been fired over this for the first time, right? And the first example of that I could find was somebody who was organizing a union with the Newspaper Guild. And his name is Morris Watson. He ended up actually taking his case to the Supreme Court and winning because new labor laws at the time protected him. But the relationship between a code that said journalists need to be objective and the targeting and persecution of organizers and activists and people standing up for themselves as workers was like, it just went hand in hand, right? And so I think we're still seeing kind of the consequences of that today, in that objectivity, it's more than just like a bad idea. It's like a form of social and political control that reinforces white supremacy. And so I think, if anything, I have kind of a deeper commitment to debunking it, and also a much stronger sense of being part of sort of a collective of people who are already doing that, as well as like a long history of journalists who have done the work of journalism while standing outside of that framework. And I knew that had to be there, right? And so the process was really just about like discovering that, I suppose. Do you want to respond at all? And then I'm going to read a little.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is for people who haven't read the book, and I'm a slow reader, so I haven't finished all the chapters. I tend to like jump around. But I read the Ida B. Wells chapter and just found it so inspiring and also so energizing, right? To know, and moving, like I'm moved right now to know that there is this sort of legacy of people of journalists who have been fighting to be able to reveal truths that the status quo is trying to suppress through this purportedly neutral value of objectivity, right? And just being, sort of like cognizant and aware of those figures and reading about them, in all of these different contexts, the Vietnam War, the AIDS crisis, et cetera, it is just a really incredible and valuable contribution to me personally, and I hope to anybody who reads the book.
I think another thing that emerged for me over the last couple years, because I was no longer working in this mainstream media context, was like the ability to look more critically at some of my own work, beyond just, I think I knew that, signing off on saying, oh, I won't be an activist anymore or whatever. I was kind of just lying, you know what I mean? Like, so I wasn't like too hard on myself about that. But there were other things that I participated in that are part of the structure of this professionalized model of the individual journalist who reports on some community that they're not a part of, right? That's the objectivity sort of model that I participated in and did, that I think were very exploitive and extractive. and potentially very harmful in certain ways, and that stuff is also a part of objectivity. It's like taken to its full conclusion, it's objectifying, right? And it turns like people and communities and stories into objects to sort of produce and consume and sell in this market of stories. And so that's the thing that I'm like sitting with more now than I was a couple years ago, because I was still doing it a couple years ago. And like, so in some ways not letting myself think too hard about what am I actually doing, and why, and who is it serving, and how much is it serving like my career to do this, or the outlet that I work for, versus the communities that I might, and people that I might be writing about.
Yeah, and I feel like increasingly, even as, we come from, positions of otherness and positions of marginalization, I am also like more and more, especially as my career has progressed, like so much more cognizant of the ways in which I also employ my privilege, right? And that I am in an extremely privileged position simply by the very virtue of being able to disseminate my ideas to a large number of people through these media outlets, right? And that position alone already by definition makes me a subject who has a particular point of view that is different from somebody who doesn't possess those abilities or those mediums through which they can communicate their ideas, right?
So I'm going to read a little.
Yes, please.
From the chapter of the book.
Story time with Lewis Wallace.
So this chapter in the book is called The Assault on Reality, which is, I pulled that phrase from a right-wing media headline about trans people who they literally believe are assaulting reality by being trans. So, which I think has some interesting ties to the idea of objectivity. But I'm not going to talk about those people right now. I'm only reading part of the thing. I went in for a diagnosis, but I already knew what I had. The trick was to tell the symptoms just as the doctor wanted to hear. And I knew from reading and from hearsay what she'd require me to say. I can't stand my body. I've been wanting to live as male for as long as I remember, and I have been living it as male for at least a year. All I want in the world is to make my femaleness disappear. And with that, I could get a letter saying I had gender identity disorder in the psychiatric parlance of the early 2000s. That letter would allow me to get a surgery to alter my body to feel more aligned with my inner sense of self, my inner sex. These psychiatric appointments were absurd, a performance for an audience of one who was also in on the joke. But the shrink wrote me the letter, which I showed to my parents and to a plastic surgeon in Texas before I got my breasts removed in 2005. I was 21 when I had the surgery, a double mastectomy with nipple reconstruction, and I had been out as transgender for a little over 5 years. How did I know this was the real me? Why would someone as effeminate and soft as I was want to, quote, live full-time as a man, unquote, as I had told the psychiatrist at the free clinic in San Francisco? Well, I had lied. I didn't want to live full-time as a man. I wanted surgery in order to align with an inner sense of self that had little representation in either medical or media discourses about trans people at the time. I had to lie to get the letter, and I had to get the letter to get the surgery. So I pretended to be normal, or at least normative, a normal male stuck in a female frame, despite the fact that this story never resonated with me. When I made this choice, I was changing my own body, but through this change, I was also helping to change what was possible in the world. It was a world at the time that said that people like me, non-gendered, genderqueer, non-binary people, simply didn't exist. There were men and women and a few folks born in the wrong bodies who simply needed to be corrected through medical intervention. I knew I was none of these, and so I had to help create a new language, both linguistic and somatic, a new kind of body for myself. In doing so, I also changed reality. This insight that we have the power to change reality has been with me since I was young, and it is key to my understanding of what journalism is and could be. Throughout my exploration of objectivity, there remains a nagging question for me about the underlying philosophical problem of facticity and truth claims themselves. Objectivity isn't only a set of protocols for being unbiased, fair, and balanced that I reject because it is impossible, impractical, or oppressive, though I think these are all true. It hinges on a more fundamental belief that there is a knowable world, a way of seeing that once we set aside our own subjectivities, can be universally achieved, or at least universally agreed upon. It hinges on an understanding of truth that turns all bodies and shapes into objects. The ocean, the human body, human events can ultimately be known and spoken of and described from some unassailable point of view. It is this objectification, not just the protocols of journalistic objectivity, that I believe make it an unsalvageable framework. I'm far from the first, of course, to come to this conclusion. Objectivity has been debunked and debated for decades now in the fields of history, philosophy, anthropology, gender and race studies, to name only a few. If we can only ever see through our own subjectivities, isn't the attempt to tell true stories futile? If nothing can be definitely proven, can anything at all be true? In a way, that one's easy to answer. Dispensing with the myth of objectivity is not about rejecting the possibility of truth altogether. It's about accepting the possibility of multiple truths. And I want to stop there because I think that's a good jumping off point for you, Meredith, to Meredith's stories come through later in this same chapter, but one of the reasons that I reached out to you was because I feel like you, in your journalism, had figured out ways to express that idea that there can be multiple truths and even contradictory truths, and to bring that subjectivity into the work. So how do you do that?
Yeah, and I think just to briefly respond to what you read, I think one of the things that I really get out of that is that removing or pushing against the concept of objectivity is not about setting aside truth or ethics. It's holding the status quo to the same ethical standard that the status quo holds marginalized people to. And I think, yeah, in terms of navigating these spaces, one of the things that has really benefited my career is just the fact that I'm kind of a master code switcher, right? So I have a Tagalog-speaking Filipino self that is a lot sweeter, actually, than my American self. My American self is more intellectual. My stepmom always asks me to switch to Tagalog whenever we're having an argument because she thinks I'm nicer in Tagalog. But I think that as someone who is able to simultaneously speak the language of the establishment and yet at the same time maintain close relationships with people who are marginalized, I end up in these positions where something happens that is relevant to a marginalized group that I belong to, right? And they just can't get either the white or the cis or whatever. People are always asking me for sources, right? People are always asking me for contacts, right? Do you know people in the Philippines? Do you know? And invariably I do, right? And when I don't have time to report the story, and if I like the person and I think they have good politics, I often put people in touch, right? But it's also often the case that there are just stories that would be very difficult for somebody else to do that I'm uniquely qualified to do. One of those examples would be I, for a long period of time, reported on the Jennifer Laude case, which is a case involving a Filipina trans woman in a former military base in the Philippines who was murdered by a US Marine, right? So I am a trans woman who speaks Tagalog, who grew up an hour and a half away from that, from that base, right? So an editor would, and, like I have some journalistic credentials, right? So if I pitch the story to an editor, they kind of know that it would be very, very hard for them to find a white cis person who speaks Tagalog and has access to Filipino trans women, right? And so I get sent to do the story. And in the process of doing that, I also carry with me the values that I have. And I tend to be like not, my partner describes me as a person who really likes following rules unless I don't like the rule, in which case I very publicly break the rule and dare the person to punish me for doing it. And that's actually true. And, that is something that I do.
Very identifiable.
Just because for me, it's just like, it's a matter of principle, right? And so, when I wrote that Vice piece, it was really important for me to position myself as a person, as a person who did not helicopter in, as a person who spoke, spoke the language that the people who were in the story were speaking. And I just didn't feel like that was something that I can omit, right? And thankfully, my editor at Vice was super supportive of that. And even though the industry itself can be, has all of these conventions, there are also many editors who work within the industry who are supportive of, of these types of values, right? And I just always look for them and I follow them. Like I tend to, when people see that my byline travels, it's because like I'm following the editor that I like. Because I think in a lot of cases that's more important than the institution.
I also want to ask you about a question that I asked you when I was interviewing you for the book. Because, I was writing about these conservative critics who believe that, that trans people are propagating gender ideology. Familiar with this? Gender ideology, that's a thing that we're doing, which I kind of love. Like, it's used in a negative way in conservative media. Google it if you're not, or don't Google it, but it just... Actually, never mind that, but...
Just trust us.
Just trust me. It's used in this way. Gender ideology, they're bad, they're propagating gender ideology, they're teaching it to the children, whatever. But I kind of love that because I do think it's gender ideology. I just think it's the right gender ideology, which is like the subjectivity question here. It's sort of a core question in a way, like if our genders and gender identities and identity in general, right, is in some way coming from this subjective place and only we can attest to it, what makes our sort of version of reality, how do we chalk that up against these assault on reality people who have their version of reality and their gender ideology? And is it just sort of an equal playing field between those two sets of ideas, or like how do we reconcile that?
Right, and the thing, I don't remember what I said in the book. I remember rolling my eyes.
I wrote like she rolled her eyes in response to the question.
But the thing that I'm going to say now, right, is that we do live as a society we do have like understood conventions about, about what it is, or about how we want to live, right? And that one of those conventions is that people should be treated basically, like with an equal set of considerations, a relatively equal set of considerations, right? And one of those considerations is for one to respect a person's own conception of themselves, right? And so, for me, actually, I think I'm actually more, like maybe because of the fact that I grew up in a dictatorship, I'm trying to think of the word, not lenient, but I think I'm more flexible in terms of somebody believing that trans people don't exist. Like you can believe that. I'm not going to ask you not to believe it. I will write and try to persuade you that that's not the case. But that doesn't mean that you then are able that belief should override my own conception of myself, should override the conception of selves of millions of trans people in America and all over the world, right? And so these claims around, the sort of like, oh, like, well, if it's just all relative, like, can't I just like call you he whenever I want? Is not, they're bullshit, basically. I'm not sure if I guess I can say that in a podcast, right?
Oh, yeah, we're recording this for the podcast. And yes, you can. Yeah, we say other words in the very first episode. Y'all should listen. So, and I guess that, what you're saying, I think, relates to kind of one of the core, I wouldn't even say it's an argument or a conclusion that I come to in the book, but like one of the core questions that I continue to grapple with in the book, which is just sort of what do we do with the reality that like in any story we tell and in any frame we choose, we are shaping reality. And so I similarly feel like the people who are critical of gender ideology, whatever, they can be, but what reality are they shaping by propagating that set of ideas? And then I have the same question for objective status quo journalism. What reality are we shaping by not calling Donald Trump a white supremacist? Like, what truth does that contribute to in the world? What reality are we shaping by just any number of like framing decisions around what we cover and what we don't? And that I think that is a values-driven sort of set of choices, inevitably, no matter sort of where you stand. And so in some sense, it's like the theory of infinite struggle, constant battle over shaping reality, and I'm okay with that, but it leaves me with a lot of, I think, just questions that are more like personal and political and collective in nature of like, what do we do with that then? What journalism do we need to bring us closer to liberation? Like, that's really what it is.
Right, and I feel like whatever it is, it has to be more self-reflective journalism. There's so many choices that journalists and editors, Lewis and I have both worked as editors, even what you judge to be news, what you judge to highlight, right? Like what you choose to assign, let alone all of those like hundreds and hundreds of decisions. The journalism industry is really good at obfuscating all of the ways in which we curate knowledge for our own purposes and curate information in order to persuade people about our point of view, which we don't actually often, in this sort of like status quo journalism model, don't actually advance openly, which means that is actually like more deceitful, and I would argue less truthful, when people do that. And that's something that I have experienced working in newsrooms, is constantly being told. When I submit drafts, people constantly tell me, oh, like you're showing too much of the sausage being made. Like let's cut all of this, like how you got to the place, like who you talk to get there. Because what people want is that somehow, like, I, the intrepid journalist, just magically appear into thin air, from out of thin air, and all of a sudden have access to all of these people and all of these contacts. And I'm the person who wants to say, well, no, like I was there at the first gathering of the Pulse employees after the Pulse, what do we call it, tragedy, because of the fact that, a trans drag queen friend of mine was good friends with the manager of the Pulse nightclub at the time. I feel like that's relevant information, those types of connections. But often we're encouraged to actually obfuscate. We're encouraged to pretend like stories exist in a vacuum. And I actually think that's unethical.
I agree, and I think it's a standard that was formed in a completely different political context and moment, right? Like that idea of the like heroic individual journalist who comes in and just neutrally has all the information somehow was like formed at a time when only basically white men were in newsrooms,
And it's super visceral for me, because like when people edit me that way, I read myself and I read, whiteness into my prose, and that is really, as somebody who is already perceived as white in the world against my will, I find that really offensive when people do that.
Yeah, and I think like the exciting thing to me about this moment that we're in journalism, and even in terms of the internet and how journalism is distributed, and the fact that our identities as journalists are so much more available to people, is that I think there's a lot of opportunity to regain trust or gain trust in the first place through transparency. And I've also been thinking a lot about accountability, actually, like as a journalist, but also just like as a human coming from, the intersections of privilege and oppression that I experience, and trying to do work that in some way contributes to collective liberation. When I'm able to state that publicly, I can also be held accountable to that publicly as well, and I think that's a good thing. And so, we see this, like the criticisms of the New York Times that Hope read a response to, where there, there's not really a set of values that the New York Times has to be accountable to if they never will show their hand, And so what they haven't admitted is that their values are like neoliberal, pro-capitalist status quo, right? But that is what it is. But I think like for us as journalists trying to do something else, we can be more accountable to our various communities through that sort of transparency in subjectivity.
And I really want to live in a world where I can be confronted in those ways, right? I feel like increasingly one of the things that happens, just over the course of the past few years, one of the things that I've noticed is that as I've increasingly accumulated cultural capital, people are more and more hesitant to question my beliefs, right? Well, except trolls on Twitter, but but
that's not what I'm talking about accountability. I mean, like the real thing.
Yeah, it's harder, right? Like for instance, for like I'm not even gonna name names, right? Like I remember I was executive editor at Them, which is Condé Nast's LGBT publication, LGBTQ plus publication, and I've stepped down and I'm now contributing editor, but I was executive editor at the time, and I don't even remember the story now at this very moment, but I assigned a story to a white trans journalist that was relevant to POC communities, and a POC journalist contacted me and said, I don't think that this is okay. Like, I think that you should have done your due diligence and tried to find a trans POC journalist who could have done this story, right? And I think that that in a status quo journalism model, that would be like, oh my God, like, you question my authority, you're the person who, you're the person who questioned my authority, so therefore you can't write for this publication. Like, that's an assumption, right? That if you critique a publication, then it diminishes your chances of writing for them. And I want to live in a world where when somebody lobbies that really, really valid critique, it actually makes me more predisposed to hire them. And it makes me more predisposed to be able to, to see that somebody is questioning the ways in which we do things and are making things better, right? And that requires a lot of self-discipline, because as you accumulate power, nobody's asking you to give it up. Like, you have to do it yourself, right? Like, nobody's asking you to, like, nobody's telling me, oh, like, you have to, like, assign things to people who question your authority in valid ways, right? Nobody's doing that, trust me. And so I'm the person who has to do it myself, and I'm the person who has to get over myself, when that happens, right?
So we're going to open it up to questions momentarily. A couple things about that. There's going to be a couple of mics circulating, and so we'll ask you to speak your question into the mic. We are recording currently all of this for the podcast, so we don't really have like a stop and start function here, but if you want to ask a question and you don't want that to go into our podcast, just come up to me afterwards and let me know, and I'm going to ask everybody to say your name and your question, and we'll, a lot of this will be edited anyway, but we'll edit you out if you don't want to be in a podcast episode, just so y'all know. And before we do that, I want to ask you to pair up again and just take a couple minutes to talk about what's coming up for you, what questions or curiosities or experiences are coming up for you, and then we'll come back and do a little bit of Q&A together. Y'all are so into your conversations. I love this. We're going to bring it back so that we can talk as a group. Something that Meredith and I were talking about before this was just how another piece of the kind of objectivity, cis male heteronormativity framework that we're trying to resist it has to do with this whole idea of authority, right, and expertise, and that's like an awkward thing in being like, I wrote the book and I'm here to answer your questions. So I guess all of that is to say, like, I'm as curious to hear your thoughts as questions, and hope that we can just kind of discuss stuff together for the rest of our time together tonight. So, who's got questions?
Hello. My name is Z. My pronouns are she and her. So a bunch of us go to a graduate school of journalism down south. We won't name names. And a lot of us are in the social journalism program, which focuses on community engagement. And so we're meant to choose a community and work with and for them. And so both of you spoke earlier about not writing for a community that you don't belong to or have a close relationship with, if you know, etc. So how would you recommend, or what is your advice, or how would you suggest we go about building the relationships, building the trust, and coming from a place of, or how do we learn to come from a place of providing a platform instead of choosing what we should and shouldn't write about and helicoptering, as you said?
I don't necessarily feel like one shouldn't write about communities that one doesn't belong to. I do feel like there's value in writing about communities that are different from yours, but that it's important to understand that that is not a neutral position. And I feel like it's also really important to communicate that in the context of the article, right? Which journalists, typically in a lot of publications don't do. I think being curious, like being a curious person who is interested in a phenomenon or a community or groups of people for their own sake prior to, so I don't take like I realize this is a position of privilege, but like I don't take assignments if I don't feel like I have a connection to that community already, So sometimes I get offered stories and I'm just like, well, actually, no, like I don't want to write a story about trans military members. I have not been interested in trans military members before, even if it's already, like it's an important issue right now. But sometimes that call to write that piece sparks an interest in me. And then I start investigating. And then after that period of actual curiosity for a community for its own sake, then I feel more prepared to write the story. Yeah, so I feel like that tends to be my MO. And I can, if anybody wants to assign pieces about gymnastics to me, I have now, I can now write about gymnastics after obsessively watching Simone Biles for years and years.
So what comes to mind for me is I write a little bit in the book about an organization called City Bureau in Chicago that trains community members on the South Side to do acts of reporting, lots of different kinds of journalism and reporting. And when they report feature stories, they meet with groups of directly affected people, not just at the end of the process, like here we wrote a thing, let's do an event, read it, what do you all think? But at the beginning and in the middle of the process. And what they end up doing, the individual reporters, is often working with people who are directly affected to figure out, even if it doesn't go into the story, what are some of the pieces of journalism or information that they need directly, right? That would help them, or things that journalists can access that somebody without those skills or tools can't. And so figuring out ways beyond the story itself to kind of like be relational and give back and not just be sort of taking and putting the story out over here. It's also a neighborhood-based, well, South Side isn't just a neighborhood, it's a whole big part of Chicago, but it's a location-based sort of project that I think allows for that kind of relationship that develops over time. But thinking of it in a sense like any relationship, right? Like trust doesn't happen just because you want it to or feel like it should, and especially where there's power differentials in whichever direction, that like trust building also involves acknowledging and navigating that. So, but City Bureau has a lot of great models for that kind of ethical reporting.
Hi. I'll quickly locate myself in the essence of subjectivity. I was born and raised in Sri Lanka, and I came to a women's college for college, and that was about 10 years ago. And I thought I wanted to be a journalist because I was also raised under a regime and a war. And I was really excited, 18-year-old me, New York Times journalist, and I found out that I was really bad at journalism because they kept asking me to be objective, and I had really strong opinions about things, and I ended up doing really badly in the class. So I thought, okay, change of goal here. And I found my way into theology later, and I found out, oh, like I love writing, and writing is really cool. But it struck me, this memory struck me in that moment about what do we tell people in training how to like build their subjectivity if people who are doing the training are knocking out subjectivity and demanding objectivity, and what does that look like, and does it demand that people not be trained as journalists and find their way into journalism later, or does it demand that people forego income in order to, like where does that go? Because the people that are able to forego income are not the people that need to be subjective in their writing. And so where, I'm just thinking about how do we do that or demand that?
We demand it. I think that's one thing. I mean, like pushing you out of journalism, that's exactly like sort of what this project is trying to stop, right? Is like stop telling people that they can't be a journalist because they're bringing their perspective, and their experience, particularly people from underrepresented groups, like that's just wrong, and I want to stop that as sort of however we can, and I think that's an organizing question, right? About like how do we build collective power, both to change the way that journalism is being taught and performed in the institutions that exist, but also to create and support structures and formats that are run in other ways, that are less hierarchical, that are run by the communities that they're about, that are driven by these other sets of values, that the values and the intentions are absolutely there, but the resources to do that kind of journalism often aren't. So yeah, I think some of it to me is like there's some degree of pushing back and trying to change those institutions, and there's some degree of organizing to create our own, media outlets and institutions and ways to propagate information that actually serve our communities.
And I do think that, we're living at a time when we do have, there are people who influence other people, right? Like we can imagine training in journalism that isn't the same as how journalists are quote unquote classically trained, in part because more and more people in positions of influence are able to communicate these ideas. One of the things that I really try to do in a lot of these situations is to expose the hypocrisies around, around the ways in which this particular value of objectivity gets deployed selectively against marginalized groups, right? So when it's new journalism, right, it's all like sexy and subjective because like white men are performing it, right? But then when...
And you mean new journalism in the sense of what's his face?
Tom Wolfe,
yeah,
and
that.
like that entire, these new journalism and also new journalism inflected feature stories. The assumption is that that the writer or the journalist like immerses into the phenomenon that they're studying, and are using novelistic and non-fictional, narrative non-fictional conventions in order to write their stories. So those people, because it's just like, oh, like I'm writing it like like it's a novel, then it can be subjective, right? But then when it actually involves questioning the values of the status quo, then we're not allowed to be subjective, right? So finding ways to argue and to expose how these values are not neutral has always been a really important strategy for me, because because I find that it's almost inevitably the case that when somebody is objecting to a trans person or a person of color or a marginalized person performing some sort of method, that there actually is like a cis white person who has done it and has been fine, right? And so
Or someone's been like, that's amazing that you came up with that method.
right. Oh yeah, that's so great. Let's give you an award. Yeah, exactly. Like you're so innovative. And so doing that allows us to then be able to, hopefully persuade people that these values that they hold dear are actually oppressive to marginalized people.
My name's Danny, he, him, and I actually belong to the same program that Z mentioned earlier, where it looks at journalism as a service for a community rather than necessarily a product to deliver to an audience. And I'm working to serve the information needs of people with disabilities in New York. And self-identifying as a cisgender white man, do you have any suggestions that I can take away to practically check my privilege when working with the community?
I'm trying to recall the period when I was perceived as a cis white man to give you. And you sort of, maybe you can field this one first, Louis.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think listen. Hopefully you're already doing that as a journalist as well. I know, but really listen. I mean, I think it's hard to like overestimate the power of entitlement in speaking as a white person, in like the idea that I was fed that my conception of the world is sort of right and natural and true, and how hard it is to overwrite that involves a lot of just like shutting up and like listening and going deep on the sort of moments of discomfort and self-doubt and not being afraid to remain in those. So that's kind of speaking from my own experience of like moments where I've like been called out or received some sort of challenge, right? Is that like it really doesn't, when somebody does sort of check you or bring up your privilege with you, they're entrusting you with something, and there's like naturally going to be a lot of discomfort and a fairly significant effort to like override this sort of, but my perspective that I was told is like feels right, or feels accurate, and it doesn't make sense what you're saying, and just to be quiet and let the override process like happen over time and filter through.
I think that's a good suggestion. The other thing that I think of a lot is sort of checking your intentions, right? Like being really, which I think is a really consistent and constant process. I experienced this, like I've done some service-oriented work in the Philippines, right? And after a couple of years of doing it, one of the things that I realize is that it's been really important for me to really query like the breadth of my motivations, to give myself both permission to say that part of the reason why I'm doing it is a certain type of like nostalgia for a life that I would have had I stayed in the Philippines, which has allowed me to then think about like whether or not, like that when I'm looking or interacting with the people that I'm working with or for, whether or not my motivations are actually serving them, right? And as somebody who is disabled and has interacted with people with whom I have been more forthright about my disability, one of the things that I've encountered is that people find it very, very difficult to think, to be able to sort of like hold in their mind somebody who is simultaneously disabled and somehow like in one way and exceptional in other ways, or like high performing in other ways. And that's just an experience that I've had, right? And so, and what I would have wanted those people who were interacting with me in those contexts to have understood is that if they were in a consistent process of figuring out, you know, like why it is that they wanted to help me, then maybe they would have understood that it would have been okay for me to simultaneously need help, but also at the same time perform better than them in other ways. I realized I was a little sassy, but.
You're like, just saying.
Hi, my name's Rebecca. I use the pronouns she, her. And I used to work in the human rights world at one of those international organizations. And a lot of the violence of the objectivity that you speak of, I like saw enacted there, especially in like a colonial imperialist framework, and especially how it would work to sort of value like white cis people going out into third world countries and then consuming other people's trauma, and the way that people of color could assimilate into those systems and aspire to that as well. And as someone who's worked on a country that I identify with through the diaspora, I found my own way to navigate that, and I'm transitioning into the journalism world now. And I just wanted to ask, in terms of like concrete advice of how you navigate it. I'm just personally, I've had an experience once. I'm from a working class immigrant community, and an editor telling me an article I wrote about a working class immigrant community that I should rewrite it according to a different lens, and sent me an example article that was like literally writing about an immigrant community like a zoo, and like, look at these sounds you hear when you come here, and like how this feeds into a lot of the commodification of like trauma of immigrants, especially in the US right now. So I know you had mentioned like you have a list of editors that you would follow when they would go to different publications. Like, what other advice do you have for navigating a field that's so saturated with this mythology of objectivity?
I can't like assert that I'm the best person to give advice on like keeping your journalism job while standing up for people ask me this question a lot, and I'm like, I'm sorry, it's there's a lot of like moral and ethical compromises and choose your battle moments, I'm afraid, you know. But I think the biggest thing that comes up for me in terms of like the bigger picture there is like, how can we build more collective power to support each other in those kind of moments? So you're like alone in that moment, right? Standing up to your editor. And there's a bunch of other people, and I know because they're emailing me, who are alone in those same moments, standing up to their editor, right? And so like, how do we build structures, whether it's unions or private groups of journalists who are communicating with one another, or groups of allies within the organizations where we're working, to make it less risky for you as an individual to do like the pushback that you need to do, and to make sure that you feel supported enough to stay in that work. Because it just might not go well. Those things might not go well for the individual, but I do really believe that we can like build power around that collectively. And I see a lot of efforts towards that, and I feel like I've also been the beneficiary of those in terms of, you know, I did get fired, but the effort that followed after that to push back and to have that conversation was supported by a lot of people who still work in journalism. And the more people who take those risks, the more people can take those risks. And that's just real and true, and it doesn't have to be on any one of us, you know. And I want to especially encourage like white people with job security to take those kinds of risks, because you probably have more security in your position than you even realize. You know, it does happen that like white people get fired like for these things, but it happens so much more often and is so much more likely to happen to people of color. Like, that's just very real. So yeah, that's another piece of that I think we just all should be thinking about, like how we can support each other and take risks. So you don't have to be alone. That's really my answer to your question.
I feel like too, strategizing and figuring out how to retain your independence is something that has been an important factor. like in terms of how I navigate, right? Like I had a pretty negative experience as a staff writer at BuzzFeed, feeling like I wasn't able to cover the stories that I wanted to in the way that I wanted to. And when I was recruited to be an editor at them, I was really, really clear about the conditions under which I was willing to work for that publication. And I did a lot of due diligence to make sure that that the terms under which I was willing to work were satisfied. But ultimately, I personally am much more comfortable being a freelance journalist, and the way that I've been able to do that has been to try to find other sort of like quick, lucrative means of financial support, so that then I can try to free up as much of my journalism work to be as independent as possible. For me, that has actually meant I do freelance translation and interpreting work. It turns out that being fully bilingual in Tagalog and English is a lucrative skill to have in this environment. So if you're ever in Alabama and are looking at the Tagalog translations of educational materials in the public schools, that is my work. So yeah, so finding those, whether it's copywriting, like non-byline copywriting, a lot of people do that, right? And then what tends to happen is, like, when you're a freelance, the weird thing about the position of the freelance journalist is that it's less well paid overall, but it actually allows you to accumulate more cultural capital because you're able to work on stories that are more innovative potentially, or stories that institutions are afraid to cover internally, because they're afraid of the ways in which it would reflect on their institution. But then if it's like, oh, it's just a freelancer who's doing it, often you're kind of given permission to do it. And as you accumulate cultural capital, hopefully that then can translate into economic sustainability that would allow you to do the type of work that you want to do.
And you can use your cultural capital to support other people with less
Yes.
of that access and power to keep their jobs and fight the good fight. So we could take one more question.
Hi, my name is Anton. I use they, them pronouns. I actually really appreciate all the conversation about immigration and dictatorship because I grew up in Ukraine under a government that was trying to shed this these dictatorial kind of trappings, but wasn't trying all that hard and it wasn't really working. And I guess my question is more fundamental, because before you can get to standing up to the editor or getting fired independently of those things, you have to work up the emotional strength to write the things that need to be written that you can write. And I've been struggling with that a lot lately, and I'm wondering, what is your advice for when you're sitting in your room and you can't seem to actually put words on paper or on computer or whatever? How do you get there that you have something to write, but you can't seem to actually create it?
I do a lot of ritual and placemaking. I don't just sit there. I get back up, and even on this tour, I have a box of just little ritual objects and things that I consider magical or that are meaningful to me, and index cards where people wrote down their utopian visions for journalism, the things that inspire me, and I keep those close, and I sort of place set with that. And it's really, for me, kind of spiritual work to be grounded enough to do the meaningful, creative and journalistic work that I want to do in the world. And so, yeah, I try not to beat myself up about it. I do a lot of ritual and place setting and grounding and sleeping enough. Mm-hmm.
I also find that giving yourself, I give myself, there are certain stories that I was just telling a friend this recently, a really big publication that I pitched was interested in the story that I wanted to write, that I thought I wanted to write, right? And then and the pitch was accepted, and I wrote 90% of the story, and I couldn't finish it because I didn't feel emotionally prepared for it to come out into the world. That was 2 years ago. And I think that that's fair and that's valid, and it's okay to allow yourself to do that, as long as in the meantime, I am in the meantime doing the work for myself to be able to get myself to a place where I can finish that story someday, right? So that's the first thing. Like I think it's okay not to be able to, to write about the thing that you want to write about but can't. In terms of, I think routine for me is like super, super important. So I write at around the same time every day. I engage in the same rituals, like I make myself coffee, I free write, like a page. I think when things become routine, then it doesn't feel like starting to write is an investment that I have to make every day. It's just like brushing my teeth now, right? Like doing, 2 or 3 hours of work in the morning is the same to me as like taking my dog for a walk or brushing my teeth.
So we are going to wrap up. There are books for sale over there, and I'll be there for a little bit signing them if you want that. I also have posters of Ida B. Wells and postcards that are really beautiful, designed by an artist named Billy D, that I'm selling at a sliding scale as a fundraiser for the View from Somewhere podcast, which my final plug with that is that there's a new episode of the podcast out today that's all about organizing and journalism and labor organizing and how this objectivity history relates to labor history. So y'all should check that out, View from Somewhere. And thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Barnard, and thank you, Meredith.
Thank you, Lewis.
Solidarity forever.